Here is your WESN News on the Hour. I'm Naomi McNish. Thanks for joining us. Here are the headlines. Mother pleads for help as son vanishes in Antigua. Kamla Persad-Bissessar to be sworn in as Prime Minister. Abdullah says the election marks a turning point for the country, and internationally, Spain investigates deaths linked to blackout. Now for the details. The mother of missing 21-year-old Thomas Vasquez is pleading for answers after he disappeared in Antigua on April 15th. Candy Jagasha says the sudden silence from her son, who usually calls multiple times a day, is deeply troubling. Vasquez had just returned to the island for work on a legal marijuana farm when he went missing. A friend last saw him that morning and later filed a police report. Jagasa, who is in Trinidad, says she hasn't been contacted by authorities and feels helpless. Volunteers continue to search the area around the farm in Clanville. Jagasha, speaking through tears, says she's living every parent's nightmare and longs to hear her son's voice again. UNC leader Kamla Persad-Bissessar is expected to be sworn in as Trinidad and Tobago's new Prime Minister on May 1st, following the party's win in Monday's general election. The UNC claimed 26 seats, unseating the PNM and forming a majority with the support of the Tobago People's Party. Talks are underway for cabinet appointments, with names like Devish Maharaj tipped for Attorney General and Dr. Randy Ramadasing for Energy Minister. Several Senate positions are expected to go to members of UNC coalition partners. Persad-Bissessar, who previously served as Prime Minister from 2010 to 2015, is now preparing to lead his second administration. MSJ political leader David Abdullah says Monday's general election marks a historic turning point for Trinidad and Tobago. He says voters rejected a third term for the PNM and delivered a clear mandate for change by electing the UNC to power. Abdullah hopes the new government will urgently tackle structural reforms and inequality and fulfill promises made during the campaign. He praised the electorate for demanding better and commended UNC's historic seat win, including victories in traditional PNM strongholds by two former MSJ members. Abdullah also congratulated the Tobago People's Party on securing both Tobago seats and giving the island a stronger voice in Parliament. Internationally, 3 members of a family were found dead in northwestern Spain after a nationwide blackout triggered chaos across the region. Authorities suspect carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty generator may have caused their deaths. The power outage shut down major systems across Spain and Portugal on Monday. Other deaths are also under investigation, including a woman in Madrid who died in a fire likely caused by a candle, and a woman in Valencia whose ventilator failed. Authorities are still working to determine the cause of the widespread blackout, which affected traffic, metros, and mobile networks. Well, that's news to the hour on WESN. I'm Naomi McNish. Thanks for watching.
WESN.
Good morning and welcome to Talking Points. A slight change in the flow of today's show because I am joined immediately by one of our band of contributors who unfortunately was not able to join us on the night of elections. But, of course, you know him, and his opinion and insight are one that we value, so he's here to join us this morning. I'm speaking of former youth parliamentarian Kemuel Pascal. Kemuel, thank you for joining me again. Welcome back to Talking Point.
Yes, Sean, good morning. Good morning to you and those in studio, and good morning to the entire viewing and listening audience of Trinidad and Tobago.
So the results, I guess let's go with, the first thing to look at. I believe it may end up being 26-13-2, depending on how the recounts goes, if I'm not mistaken. And that result, to some extent, I think to the analysts is shocking. I didn't hear anybody say from the political scientist side or the political operator side that the UNC could potentially pick up 7 seats wholly on their own. I think a lot of the math would have included the TPP taking away the 2 Tobago seats, when you're thinking the PNM could lose maybe 3 to 5, maybe 7. But there have been people outside of politics, maybe living away from the northwest corner of the country, who were potentially a bit more confident in this result moving in. Dr. Mohammed himself was looking at things like San Fernando West even before the election as potential weaknesses. Did this result surprise you in any way, or did you see signs, whether in advance or in hindsight, that things could have reached this point?
Sure. So from all analysis and what everyone has been saying, and even from my own analysis, either that it was going to be extremely close, or that if it was in fact that it was a win for the UNC, it would be like a landslide win, basically. So what we've seen is that the only seats that I had really going to the UNC would have probably been St. Joseph. And I said, even if the PNM were to lose St. Joseph, they would probably pick up Moruga Table, and instead that has now flipped and gone totally different direction. And I think it's a result that a lot of people did not expect. They suspected, but they did not expect the results to trend in that direction, especially more so in Tobago West, where we saw, as far as the last count that I know, just 45 votes separating the TP from the PNM.
I mean, I didn't necessarily expect the southwestern end of the island to necessarily go the UNC's way. As much as I thought Clyde Elder, I couldn't speak to the area president of the OWTU, but Clyde Elder, I thought he was a good union leader. But you know how things goes. Usually, what were considered safe seats, it's an uphill battle. And of course, the PNM, you know, they experience the detriment of contesting the safe seats of the other side. But outside of the Northwest, it seemed like the UNC had legitimate shots. And maybe even if, like, say, certain seats like Port of Spain, St. Anne's North was contested under the UNC banner, speculatively, they might have got more votes. Not that they would have unseated Stuart Young. That's the thing. Did you see so many extra seats? Because I actually thought Tobago West could go. It's interesting that it's still close, but ultimately it went. But some of these other seats, I think La Joqueta, some of these other seats, San Fernando West, of course, look how close San Fernando East is. Didn't necessarily see this coming.
As I said before, a lot of people did not see this coming. It's a lot of results unpacked, not just for the UNC, but for the PNM as well. And you're probably correct, because if you look at seats like Port of Spain South, the 3 Diego Martin seats, Diego Martin West, Diego Martin Northeast, and Diego Martin Central, all of those places like Laventille East, Mova, Laventille West, all those seats had a voter turnout of somewhere less than 45%. And so that says a lot about the PNM based on how they felt about everything that happened. And if you recall, when I was on the show last week, I said to you that this whole transition from PM Rowley to Stuart Young now being the PM, and then, well, the subsequent elections, it would have trended a lot in this election and would have been one of the factors that would either cause the PNM to get over the line or not cause them to get over the line. And if they didn't, people would now bring it up, and so said, so done. And so you will look, when you analyze the results, you will see that a lot of the PNMBs did not come out. They chose not to support another party, and they simply didn't come out.
When looking at the numbers, the UNC actually had more votes than the PNM from the last election, and that's without contesting the 2 Tobago seats. And potentially that also includes the fact that it was the PP and not the UNC that contested a lot of the northwestern PNM seats. Is that surprising? Because to some extent it suggests, despite that the total voter turnout, I believe, is less, the support for the UNC didn't just grow, it grew significantly to the point where it could have even eclipsed the support for the PNM, even if the PNM voters actually stayed out. And then the actual voter count could have been higher than it was in 2020.
Yes, that's correct. It means to say that the UNC's campaign would have been able, the campaign that they ran, sorry, would have been able to invigorate their base to now come out and support them, because you see them now capturing more support. In fact, they got somewhere in the vicinity of a little more than 25,000 more votes than they would have gotten in 2020. So it says a lot about the campaign that they ran. It says that, as you possibly said, maybe if they had run in possibly North St. Anne's West, which is Stuart Young's seat, they would have been able to probably even capture even more votes. And so that says a lot about the campaign, but it's a lot of results analyzed, and there's a lot of intricate things that can be analyzed.
What would you say was the major, singular major reason, if there is one? And if not, you could explain what you think the reasons are. Is it that the PNM incumbency was just an uphill battle with regards to unpopularity when, you have policies to criticize, the UNC doesn't? Is it the Stuart Young question that you brought up previously, or the UNC's campaign that you just spoke about? What do you think may have been the most important factor in these results?
I think one of the most important factors in the results is rather that single transition from Rowley to Stuart Young. People felt that he didn't earn it as much as they would have respected him and his work ethic and all of that. They felt like he did not earn that position, and a lot of people just came together for the campaign and just huddled. But really and truly, there was a lot of discontent even among them, and even outside of that. Remember, in an election, you're not just trying to get your base; you are trying to get the entire population, because you want to win, or even win once again. And so it's not about whether your base is satisfied or whether your base is not satisfied, but you have to think about the swing voter, the undecided person, the person who's voting on the single issue. And so I think on that basis they failed, because there was a lot of discontent and disenfranchised within and among the population. And I think that's one of the important factors that people need to analyze and to understand.
Well, I mean, outside of crime, I keep saying the SRC recommendations, I think in hindsight, I mean, we knew it would look bad, but maybe we even underestimated how bad it would look. And then the Auditor General situation and the unaccounted for money, those things I keep hearing being brought up leading up into the election, not by the UNC, but rather by people who, when speaking about the election, that's what I'm hearing. And of course, the unions, and to some extent, rightfully so, took the government to task. Stuart Young tried to deflect it, but he basically pointed out the fact that when he was a lawyer for the unions, he was on the other side of the argument. Did these things, do you think they played a major part in that? Because if you're trying to get to the undecided voters, it's up to the PNM to pick the leader, right? But the undecided voters may be more on the issues.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. That SRC report played in a lot to what the way in which people voted in this election. 47% as opposed to 4%, that would have factored in a lot. Let's be real, there are a lot of working class people in Trinidad and Tobago, and that would have definitely factored in. When you look at everything, people voted in this election on bread and butter issues a whole lot. When you look at the economics and everything surrounding what is at play right now, it's more of economics, bread and butter than anything else.
Did the snap call for an election hurt the Stuart Young's candidacy? Because at the end of the day, when they first started, it seems as though the UNC got a head start on the PNM. And then to some extent, the PNM was catching up in certain ways, but in other ways, they didn't catch up until the 11th hour, and it might have been too late. And then on top of that, the UNC's campaign, by some accounts, matured over time, whereas the PNM campaign maybe was still fractured and trying to figure out its way. And the reason why I bring it up is, at the end of the day, the UNC didn't call the election date. The PNM called the election date, and it's very strange, I find, to be called flat-footed when you are the one making the decision to set the tone, to set the timing.
Well, the thing about it, and you're absolutely correct, they are the ones who had who held the power rather to call the election date. And so it's quite interesting that they were not prepared in the way that we saw their campaign roll out. In fact, their campaign was one of more reactionary as opposed to being proactive. And you would think that being the ones that had the incumbency and being there, you would think that they are the ones that would now have a much more better prepared campaign. And if you look at their campaign, you would see that at one point it was all in for TNT, then they started to say a bold new chapter, then they started to say let us write a new chapter, and so it's kind of like they were trying to feel out the population. I think on the show last week I mentioned it. I mentioned the fact that I wish they had a little more time, because I felt like their messaging was not really selling. Because if you look at the platform speeches, it's not that, yes, they were selling their plans and stuff, but a lot of the times the speakers would come on and now react to stuff that was said by the UNC. I mean, yes, you have to be listening, and yes, you have to keep your ears open and respond, but your entire presentations, your entire campaign meetings can't just be on responding to what the UNC said. It says a lot about your overall strategy.
Well, was this election result, we said, you know, you only vote out governments, but the UNC did get an increase in vote. Was it mostly a rejection of the previous PNM administration and wanting to try something new? Or was it that the UNC's messaging perhaps maybe struck a better chord, the tone of the messaging gave people more confidence? I do believe all of my criticisms for the UNC for the last maybe 4 years, to some extent, they improved on a lot of how they communicated. Kamala Persad-Bissessar herself, Philip Edward Alexander even, right, as one of her key allies, getting the unions and the job that Ansel Roger and the new PSA president did on the campaign trail, like it potentially gave people the confidence that, look, maybe last year we might not have voted for UNC, but after hearing their campaign to the PNM's campaign, we have more hope that they will lead us for the next 5 years out of whatever situation we find ourselves in.
Well, messaging is one, but I think a key thing that you need to look at in analyzing the results, and you need to look at where they would have gotten those increasing votes, right? That's key. So I think I haven't been able to analyze the results in that depth as yet to say, well, UNC would have gotten it in just their usual safe seats. So I can't answer on one hand, but I would also like to say is that the extra votes that they would have picked up could be factored into places that they won over this year that were previously held by the PNM. So for instance, Tunapuna, they probably would have gotten more votes in Tunapuna, places like La Hokata, Paru, where they won, St. Joseph, so all those places would have accounted for those more votes that you now see.
Now, of course, we're anticipating the cabinet. Right now, the Prime Minister and the AG is going to be sworn in. We're anticipating the cabinet. Like, just with regards to timing, some people have said, okay, they need to hit the ground running. Although I would caution, yes, they need to do that because there's some very real needs, but they also, I don't want to necessarily see all sort of short-term plans coming out. Do you think that the UNC, I mean, I'm hoping that they have a balance. What do you think might be the priorities, and what cabinet posts might you be looking at to be key? So like the short-term decisions that are going to be coming up now, what key things you think are going to be on the table right now in the next couple of weeks, couple of months?
Well, one, you need to look at your Minister of Trade, and Trade and Industry. You need to look at your Minister of Finance, your Attorney General, your Minister of Public Utilities. Those are key ministries that factor into some of the basic services that we need here in Trinidad and Tobago. You also need to look at your Minister of Foreign Affairs. Because of all that has taken place from a geopolitical standpoint, those ministries will be key to, in terms of who are at the helm of those ministries, will be key to how we're going forward. You also need to look at your Minister of National Security, your Ministry of National Security. I know the UNC has always said that their plan is to split the ministries into like Home Affairs, External Affairs, and then they will also have a Ministry of Justice. And so those people, those appointees are key to how your plan shaped out. But I think immediately what they need to look at is the economy, and the budget going forward. We're already in May, so it's the 1st of May. Budget is due anytime after the 30th of September. And so I think that is key.
Well,
that is key. Budget immediately and budget planning, because the PNM would have already been in budget mode. And so it's now for them to either say, okay, we're sticking with some of these things or we're not.
Right, because don't they have technically, normally a mid-year budget review, there's also an auditor general report that's due. So these things are coming up even before the budget for next year. How interested are you to see what the UNC would do with that? Because I guess that's the thing. Are they going to hold certain programs? Are they going to start making changes now? Would it be wise for them to start making certain changes now given the fact that basically the country said we don't necessarily like what the PNM was doing?
I think thing about this is that it will be quite interesting to see what they decide to focus on. But I know obviously for them, national security, finance, the economy, foreign relations, and trade would be things that need to be dealt with immediately from an immediate standpoint. What they decide to do afterwards would probably kind of tell you the direction in which they are heading. But I think this very first year and these first few months will not just are not just key, but would make or break this administration, because this is like where people have voted for change. They've given you a mandate, and so what you do going forward in the next 3 months are very, very key to how you are perceived in the long term.
Well, I mean,
So
I understand that that is human nature. I see it in sports. You see it also to some extent in politics. The short-term memory, for better or worse. But the flip side to that is, don't you still run the risk that you might be sacrificing the future if you focus too much on short-term wins?
no, well, I'm not necessarily speaking about short-term wins. I'm just speaking about the way in which they decide to carry out and to carry forward their plans. So that's key. And what they decide to prioritize, national security needs to be prioritized, as I said before. The economy needs to be prioritized. Whether you all are going to make drastic changes to the budget, which is already in progress, or whether you are sticking with what kind of currently exists, because ministries would have already been submitting draft estimates all the way from March. So there are stuff already in train. So it's important it will be interesting to see what they decide to do.
Now, switching gears, of course, when someone loses in this manner, it's actually, I actually think it's kind of ironic. And I don't know if you would agree with me, but way before I started pointing out that I saw parallels between what was going on with the PNM now and what was going on with the PNM before 2010. Down to the point where we even had NH International complaining about contracts being awarded to a Chinese firm, right? Down to how the internal situation was going on with certain players within the PNM with this whole question of transition of power, all right? It's not, obviously the details are not exactly the same, but some of the players were there back in 2010. And ironically, Stuart Young calls an election that took some people by surprise, not necessarily those operating in the political sphere. And now we have results where the PNM, 2010, 12 seats, 2013, 13 seats. Am I right to potentially say there are quite a bit of parallels going on here with how this thing came about?
Correct. Quite a bit of parallels, and also parallels to the US, of course.
Yes.
Because if you think about this, the thing about it is that people were saying US elections would be close. And on the election night, you just saw a whole wave for the Republicans. And so the thing about it is that there are a lot of parallels, as you mentioned, from 2010 as well, in terms of the manner in which things have now unfolded following the general elections. But on that issue, I see that they are attempting to acquire things really quickly within the PNM and to, dispel any sort of dis-ease, if I may put it like that.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, I think it seems as though they're being very decisive in moving on to the new political leader, new opposition leader of the PNM. In many ways, that's what happened once Mr. Manning lost the last election, and now we're seeing it here. Maybe it's, dare I say, if you know anything of what happened in those meetings back in 2010, it might be more civil now, maybe, than before. But right now, Dr. Keith Rowley, he is attempting to fall on his sword by basically saying, I lost, I lost. There's something interesting. I think I did say this, and this is not necessarily how I expected it to go, but I may have said this last year, you live by the political sword, you die by the political sword. I didn't necessarily expect it to be, the parallels to be so in line, because to some extent, he's essentially going out the way his predecessor went out. And now, dare I say, we actually find the party coming back to someone whose time in office began with Mr. Manning and arguably would be more of a Manning person than a Rowley person. I would say, maybe Ms. Beckles wouldn't say it, but I have that impression. And of course, as somebody pointed out, somebody who is not necessarily political, Brian Manning, the one dot of red in the sea of yellow is San Fernando East. Brian Manning, at least for now, kept his father's seat. So it's almost like if the legacy of the PNM is, dare I say, course correcting, or at least shifting back, ironically, to maybe something that resembled more of the past?
Well. It's interesting as you mentioned, and when you were speaking, I just thought about coming back full circle. When you said die by we live by the political, so we die by it. It's almost that the party has almost come full circle back to where they were in 2010, and you're absolutely right. From all I've heard, those meetings in 2010 following the May 2040 elections were much more. Now its story is much more civil than what took place then. And I think it's because the party would have learned from the experiences of 2010, because that's only 15 years ago, and they are now able to, pivot a little better, do things and handle things a little better.
What do you make of the new, well, until the MPs actually go in, we have the new opposition leader. What do you make of Penelope Beckles now? Essentially, after 2010, she was on the outside looking in, and they brought her back for the 2020 elections, I believe it was. She's managed to hold on to Rima. If they didn't bring her back, they may have lost to Rima this year, maybe even last year as well, last election as well. What do you think of Penelope's time now that she has, I guess, reached this point? One could argue this was not necessarily expected maybe 2 to 3 years ago.
But the thing about it is that she would have served in the Senate during that 2010 to 2015 period before contesting the leadership elections against Dr. Keith Rowley, where after she contested, because he was the political leader at that point in time, he would have removed her from the Senate. And the thing about it is that I think the way in which her style, in which she does things going forward, will be key to how people perceive her. A lot of people perceive her as kind of soft, and they perceive her as kind of soft. So it's important the faith that she puts on and the people that she puts in the Senate. I think her Senate bench will tell you a lot about where her thinking is and the manner in which she goes forward, attempting to rebuild the party.
Well, I mean, some would have argued that Camilla might have been perceived as soft and be controlled. Somebody pointed out, well, look at the slate now. She doesn't seem to have the same cabal that was around her back when she was prime minister. So she seems to be maybe in a stronger position as a leader right now. So is it maybe because Penelope Beckles is a woman, or she's so new to the situation? I mean, to some extent, when you're not the leader, you could only be so aggressive.
Well, no, the thing about it is that she has generally been a very poised woman, a very, seen as to be kind of softy, but I think that's not to be underestimated, because I think a lot of people are saying that about her, and she hasn't been given a fair chance to be in the position for us to see how she would really handle things. And I think that's important for people to understand. Give her a chance. In Trinidad and Tobago, we sometimes don't give people enough of a chance to prove themselves to be what they could be. And sometimes when you get in the position, that's when you actually begin to show what was just there on the inside all the time, if I may put it like that.
You summed up what I was saying by saying the PNM seems to have come full circle. Is this like a significant regime change in the party and a significant change in direction? Or is this more to keep the peace? This is the best compromise for all those that remain?
I think this is the best compromise for this comes right in the middle, right in the median, in terms of what the party has to do going forward in order to rebuild. Whether or not she will be able to stay on and fight in the party when the leadership election comes around, and she is then, if she's elected as leader, whether or not she'll be able to stay on until 2030, that's left to be seen. Because we don't know how the dynamics will shift then. We don't know how allegiances will then shift then. Remember, Stuart Young is still a member of the lower house, and whenever the leadership election comes up, he may probably want to run, despite the fact that he has now resigned as party chairman. Mm-hmm. Doing the honorable thing following the loss of a general election that he led the party into. So it's important, and it will be interesting to see how the dynamics play around then.
Well, I mean, Mr. Manning was selected opposition leader when it was 33-3, and essentially he took that ball and ran with it. Arguably, that was the correct choice given how things went for the next couple of decades, you could say. So she would be the incumbent. She would have advantages. The flip side is Stuart Young, if he might be the other potential candidate, I'm not too sure if he would. Analysts did say if he lost the election, he would be on his way out. I did potentially see, given that there's only 13 PNM MPs, because of there were so few candidates, he may have had a chance, but at the end of the day, Penny was still there. And yeah, I mean, to some extent, it's not as though the internal election is going to happen in a couple of years. It's going to happen, or at least it's slated to happen this year. The loss will still be fresh on the minds of the internal voters. Do you really, we've criticized the UNC for keeping a two-time loser, but now she's won her third attempt to get back into office. So those criticisms seems a lot weaker now. But to some extent, within the same year, would internal voters be receptive to say, hey, you kind of led us in a general election where we got thoroughly, beat down. Maybe we're not ready to have you yet. Penelope is older. Let's see. You're young. It's in your name. It's in your campaign. You're young. You could wait a decade, to come back and try again. That's what Kamala essentially did. You could slow your roll to let's see what Penelope could do because it's arguably a long time coming. Would you agree with that?
It can roll that way, but I think it's left to be seen how and what she does going forward within the party, as I said. That will determine, okay, if people really see her and and they say, yeah, we could support her, or no, we can't support her because she really isn't, or she really hasn't lived up to what we expected. So I think that's what will make or break her going forward in the internal elections.
Now,
and how people perceive stewardship.
Now, to close, because I know you have to go, and I'm kind of holding you hostage a little bit here over time, but with regards to Dr. Keith Rowley's outgoing messages, I always believe he was ready to retire. Like I said, he's looking to fall on his sword and say, I lost, Stuart didn't lose, I lost. I would disagree with that, to be honest, but it is what it is. But I think also his concession speech, he led the concession speech and spoke first that night. He had a call, and I think Amory Brown kind of mirrored it to some degree. It's now that the UNC has won, we have to look at the current government of the day and not be combative and understand if they fail, we all fail. Like now the UNC slogan is to some extent true. If they win, potentially we all win. If they lose, we definitely will all lose. What would you add to that sentiment just to close out this morning?
Well, it will be interesting because their slogan says, when UNC wins, everybody wins. But the thing about it is that, as you mentioned, if they lose in the manner in which they govern, then we all lose. And so that statement can very well come back to haunt them. Because winning is significant to people. It says something in your mind. It's something celebratory. It evokes a certain emotion. So the thing about it is that slogan can come back to bite them if they don't do well in office. So going forward, I just want to wish them all the best. And as I said, people are looking at their cabinet appointments, their key picks for trade, finance, the Attorney General's office, and also national security. So that will basically make them or break them in the next 6 months, I think.
All right, Camille, don't want to keep you any further. Thanks for joining us once again. Hope to have more conversations like this in the near future. We'll keep in touch.
Sure. Thanks so very much. Have a good day.
All right, folks, we'll take a break. When we come back, we'll continue with today's daily review. And of course, later on in the program, we'll open the phone line. Stay tuned. This is Talking About the WESN. We'll be right back after this.
My name is Dr. Stephen Carroll, the CEO at Community Hospital of Seventh-day Adventist, and we are committed to making good private health care affordable.
For all your medical needs, including dental, radiology, laparoscopy, behavioral and mental health, along with many other services, contact us for more information at 235-5479.
Community Hospital of Seventh-day Adventist,
where good private health care is affordable.
Come celebrate 15 years of Caribbean literature. It's a homecoming with stories, debates, open mics, music, workshops, films, and exciting youth and children's festivals at the 2025 Bocas Lit Fest. 50 events, over 100 writers, speakers, and performers. Check the program at bocaslitfest.com. That's bocaslitfest.com. See you at the National Library in Port of Spain from Thursday 1st to Sunday 4th May, or tune in online on YouTube.
Our award-winning show is back, and this season promises to be even more exciting than before. What's Up, Doc isn't just a title, it's a call to action for anyone who wants to improve their health and well-being. Join us on this thrilling ride towards better health on WESN Content Capital.
As always, we appreciate you starting your day with us. Let's get into this morning's first conversation.
Is the country's healthcare system more at risk more than ever?
Why it has remained unaddressed for so long.
Political parties get lots of cash, big cash from financiers, and then when they get that now, you can't account for it.
But it's really the specialist nurses who we are in a greater shortfall for.
We can tap into the resources and have them, at least form some mentorship programs.
Highlight our food systems, and which will attract persons from all over the world to come and experience something that actually supports the local economy.
We're lucky that we have a vibrant legal system that allows change to take place, and it's not that matters are just swept under the carpet and discrimination is allowed to be perpetrated.
A lot of people don't know that there were attempts to ban the carnival, suppress the carnival.
Welcome back to Talking Point. We just spoke to Campbell Pascal. He was supposed to be part of our election panel, but unfortunately, the night kind of moved a little bit too fast for us to hook up. He was on another platform as well. That was all scheduled. So unfortunately, fortunately, we had him this morning to offer his opinions on what happened. And yes, it will be interesting to see how things transition. But the transition comes with other questions. Of course, there's a new government, there's a new opposition, government majority, opposition minority, but now there's also a transition with regards to certain areas of the public sector. Now, there is a story in the this morning's Newsday, or I believe it's this morning's Newsday, State Board resignations expected after election. The thing about it is, I know that it's not just the boards and the chairman and the CEOs that are looking at this result. Usually people at the top, they might be political appointees. Some of them might be well-qualified, technically proficient individuals. Some of them might not. Case in point, the Paria board that oversaw Paria during the tragedy and their inability to deal with a crisis. And, I'll continue to highlight that as long as it's pertinent, because it's one of the worst tragedies and one of the best examples of a board appointment, in my opinion, gone wrong. And now, to some extent, there's this catch-22 situation where, do you want the incoming government to have to keep the existing boards? Some of them might be the best people for the job, and they might be unfairly pushed out for the incoming government's people. Some of them might not. This is one of those things where it's not like there's one right answer. It's probably a case-by-case basis. But one of the things with regards to the situation that I found interesting is that people at lower levels of public entities and organizations, now they were concerned about their future. Because to some extent, it's not necessarily, there are certain jobs that are political, like board appointments and managers and stuff like that. Those might get turnover. Certain staff in certain ministry office, those might see direct turnover because the incoming government wants to have their own people. You don't necessarily want disloyal people trying to do your work and implement your agenda and potentially, cut you off under the knees, undermine what you're trying to accomplish. But then there are other jobs that to some extent are seen apolitical. But the thing about it is, with a new government comes a new agenda. A new agenda means your spending is going to be different. And now, certain people that have government jobs, it's not that they're at risk of being fired because they're going to replace by a UNC person and they were a PNM person. That's not the case. They're not necessarily PNM people. They're not going to be replaced by UNC people. Their jobs might disappear when certain programs maybe get cut, get reduced. Maybe they get expanded, who knows? Certain state entities and functions, though, that are seen to some extent tied to the political agenda of a government. I won't necessarily name names, but some of them are geographically close to our location, they are concerned. And now it leads me to the question, to what extent are we doing a disservice in our society? Because I do think this exercise, we run the risk, if we put too many controls and protections, that we will have people in the jobs who no longer work well, right? That's one of the issues why a lot of government work became contract work. It was to try to solve the issue of people with tenure who couldn't be removed, that basically did what they wanted and were not productive. But the flip side is, contract workers are so easily turned over. It's hard to have consistency in these jobs, and you are potentially, in some cases, maybe roughly 50%, let's just say for argument's sake, 50% of the time you get rid of the best person for the job, 50% of the time you get rid of the worst person for the job. But that inconsistency, you're not necessarily getting the best overall result, are you? That you can achieve. And I do wonder if this is one of those things. The whole transition of our government seems to be very abrupt. And now, look, the UNC, after the elections, and they have the recounts, obviously they want to confirm, okay, who is going to be MPs and who is not. So they still have a few things outstanding, but potentially, most likely, those recounts are not going to flip those seats, but they might. And then once you know who your people are, then you know who your senators are, then you could figure out how the dominoes fall to who your cabinet ministers are, and they have to do it in a matter of days. And the opposition, of course, has to select its leader in a matter of days. It's not quite as demanding as the government, as well as their senators as well. And then, of course, the political appointments, how quickly or slowly that's going to turn over. I do wonder if our transition, one, it could have been, we need reform just in order so this process is not trying to be condensed in a week. But two, something about the transition, UNC is swapping out with, PNM is being swapped out with UNC people, of course in government, but now in the public sector, to the extent that it will happen. Should this be highlighted? Because we only really talk about it after an election, which is not necessarily the best time to try to get something on an agenda, because the election winner, they already have a whole set of things they promised, probably can't deliver on all of them, realistically speaking, in part because when you get into office, then you actually know what's going on. It's kind of hard to introduce something right after an election. Hey, but what about this? Especially since at the end of the day, for lack of a better term, the victims might be perceived by some to be supporters of the outgoing administration, and who has mercy for them. But what I'm saying is not everybody is in that situation. And it's not always, sometimes it is, it's not always the best thing. So what could we do to try to fix the situation? Because just the whole long-term protected tenureship versus contract work, I would argue, we've tried the two extremes. We're not necessarily getting to the best solution with either. Maybe we need to rethink this thing. The Public Service Commission, how that operates, there's a lot that could be improved. I don't necessarily have the answers. Right now, I am limited to just pointing out an observation of what I think is a problem. I don't like the fact that people with government jobs, yes, a lot of people with government jobs out there, they do it for a check. They're not necessarily productive. And we're talking about people in Tobago, people in Trinidad, people in ministries, people in state entities. We're talking about people in public health. We're talking about office workers, right? Public health doctors and dentists can be very irresponsible and uncaring with regards to their job, but they'll take the check. They don't necessarily care about their responsibilities, or they're not necessarily as committed as they should be, because the public sector money is not as good as the private sector. But they still want the public sector money because it's consistent. And that's the thing. Government jobs are seen as a means to get consistent salaries, not as a form of national service. That perception and all is to some extent where part of the problem starts. But how it's managed, particularly now in this transition period, can we do better? I have a friend of mine her colleagues had concerns. I think it caused her to have some concerns. And I'm like, it took me by surprise that she was worried and that her colleagues were worried, because in my mind, they're not political, but at the same time, the uncertainty of the situation. And this is one of the issues when a government is such a significant employer of the population, and why perhaps you have situations where it's not always easy to change governments. Look at the PNM administration. Between their first term and their second term, it wasn't that big of a drop-off. It wasn't that bad, but maybe there were signs that we should change, maybe, right? So that the politicians don't start to get arrogant and confident in their position. But it took these last couple of years and all of the controversies of the last couple of years for the country to really say, no. We've hit rock bottom. Hopefully this is rock bottom and we don't go any further. We now are more desperate for a change. Because a lot of the voters wouldn't want to risk, because they're public servants or they're working in state entities and what have you, they don't want to see change. They are incentivized not to vote for change. They are incentivized to vote for the incumbent. And to some extent, maybe that is going to be a factor moving in. And then we hit rock bottom and then we're forced to change. But why do we have to let it reach to that point? But then, let me just go back to the public servant who only wants to do their job and do their job well, because there are many of those who keep the systems running and they don't want to be disturbed by the politics and they try to stay out of it. And sometimes they are fortunately left alone, and sometimes they are caught in the political wake of change. It's a hell of a way to live. All right, let's move on to the next topic. And one of the things I want to caution is the fact that it was thought that the TPP, if they win 2 seats, that would be a significant victory, because the margin of the government majority to the opposition minority was not expected to be this large, 26-13. Think about it. In the last 2 elections that the PNM won, it was 21-80, I think, well, the last one I believe was 22-19. Right, let's just go with that. And it was 23-18 before, I believe, right? They lost 1 seat in the last general election, but they still maintained the government. Which begs the question, why did they act so seemingly arrogant and were so confident in the position in the first place? In hindsight, it doesn't make as much sense as it may be made before without the benefit of knowing the eventual results. But the margin of victory that the UNC has means that the 2 seats that Tobago has doesn't have quite the leverage that it could have been if it was something more akin to 21-18 or 22-17, or especially if it was 2019. Yeah. If the 2 seats were the difference in who became prime minister, well, then Tobago would have all the leverage in the world. But at the current rate, they don't. So now we have to wonder, what does this mean with regards to autonomy? It was the issue that the TPP campaigned on, but ironically, while they have a voice in Parliament now, Tobago does not have an increase in the voice in Parliament, right? Tobago representation potentially will remain the same. It's lost a senator. It's lost 2 senators because Ansel Dennis was a senator and Lawrence Hislop was a senator. I believe it's Lawrence Hislop from Tobago. Will the opposition get senators from Tobago? Part of maybe inviting the TPP to form the government. I believe I read a report where they were open to do so or willing to do so. It might be to maybe get a senator from the TPP to represent Tobago. Of course, maybe even have a cabinet minister from the TPP, maybe, but even then, the representation of Tobago in Parliament would not be significantly improved by that much. The politics for Tobago will still run into the same brick wall that it has run into for the last 10 years, and that is the national budget. To what extent can central government, as much as, and I don't always like it, or usually I dislike it, when the politics of Tobago turns it into a Tobago versus Trinidad situation. But what Tobago politicians need to understand is most local government bodies are underfunded. Not just Tobago, not just Miaro, not just Toco, not just Libre, all of the local government bodies across, including Port of Spain, are underfunded. In some cases, they don't even get their whole allotment or allocation in the budget. They might get half for the year. So to what extent could the budget allocation for Tobago be increased? That's one thing, because that would be the issue, I guess you could say, will be the placeholder issue for autonomy. Now, we've come to the point where I think Tobago needs to start to define what they're asking for in detailed terms, because it's not as though you could just, the campaign promises, and the PNM made them too in the last THA election, at the very least. I didn't necessarily follow what the Tobago campaign for the PNM was like. So this is an issue that both sides tried to campaign on, but the PNM had a pattern of behavior in the last 10 years. Local government elections, we're putting up local government reform. Post-local government elections, stop talking about that. We ain't heard none of that since. Property tax, basically, is in an incomplete state. So to some extent, it's actually pretty easy for the UNC to just dissolve property tax. I don't necessarily agree with it, but given the state that it's in, it might not hurt us as bad as we think, those who think property tax is necessary. Property tax may potentially help the local government bodies and the THA. I never really got a proper answer about its implementation in Tobago, but it is what it is. That, of course, is assuming the money goes to those bodies. So there are things on the agenda. To what extent is autonomy a priority for the UNC given our budgetary constraints and the fact that they themselves made campaign promises that need to be financed? The 10% as the starting point for union negotiations. How is that going to be financed? Because it might not be 10%, it might be higher, right? And of course, all of national security. Roger Alexander said, more resources for police. To some extent, I can't disagree with that. The problem, of course, is where you're going to find it. And now autonomy is going to have a lot of questions, and it's going to take a lot of work to get there, in part because nobody really did yes, there were consultations, yes, there were bills by the PNM in Parliament, but it didn't seem as though these things were really finalized or close to being finalized, because at the end of the day, they haven't been debated in any detailed way. And I fear that it's going to take a lot more effort than people think. Not that Tobago can't get autonomy. There is a world, however, of possibilities where it's not going to happen now in this term of office. That is not impossible. But I wouldn't say that that is something that I wouldn't say it's likely. What I would say is that I don't think it's going to be as automatic. If it was 2019 too, then Tobago could say, you got to prioritize us. But it's not. So now things get a little bit tricky. Last thing to just mention, Ansel Dennis, whereas a lot of the executive, Ron Sinanan, Stuart Young, and of course Dr. Keith Rowley, are more or less resigning from their party executive positions. Dr. Keith Rowley did formally dismiss the other two deputy political leaders from their positions. Foster Cummings, I believe, is not resigning as his position from General Secretary. Ansel Dennis, in the Tobago Council, he's not looking to move on right now. And to some extent, I can understand why. This election was not about the Tobago Council per se. This election is a national election, and it's about the national executive. And that's where you should see the turnover. To what extent is this a referendum on Ansel Dennis and his leadership of the PNM Tobago Council? It's harder to say. In fact, if Tobago West is very close, one could argue that is not necessarily a defeat for Ansel Dennis. It is a defeat for the PNM. So it'll be interesting to see how Tobago politics will then move forward, because with the THA elections, of course, you have the one minority leader for the PNM, Kelvin Morris. Then you have the other member of the minority now, Watson Duke. Lord knows what he's doing. One would expect his political career potentially should but not necessarily would be over. We still have to wait and see what the THA will look like. I believe within a year or year and a half, there might be a THA elections or sometime soon. But with this mandate and wave of support, I don't expect the TPP to lose, but it will all affect how autonomy is going to be lobbied for. That's just one of the strange things where I think it could be an ethical case study with no clear answer. The fact that Tobago autonomy needs to be debated in some other body, made up of other people. But then to what extent should Tobago have more representation out of proportion to the rest of Trinidad and Tobago, who have similar problems that the island of Tobago has? It's just one of those weird things. And it'll be interesting to see what the answers will be derived coming out of the new political reality we find ourselves in. Let's move on to the next topic. One of the things I refrained from doing, and I don't necessarily regret it because I felt it might have been piling on and being more of a personal attack than legitimate commentary and analysis, was my disagreement with how Stuart Young handled the whole situation with Venezuela and with the opposition leaders' comments on Venezuela. Because, and I had a video, and I still have the video, but I'm not going to play it. Stuart Young already lost, I'm not going to pile on. But I very much dislike the fact, and not everybody does, some people agree with him, we will agree to disagree. Kamala Pisar-Bissessor called Venezuela a narco state. Stuart Young went on the campaign trail and criticized Kamala Pisar-Bissessor for calling them a narco state. How could you do that? So disrespectful. And I didn't play the video, but I did speak about this weeks ago. How could you do that? He is the recognized elected leader of Venezuela. And the video basically had, way back in Trump's first term, he's basically calling the Venezuelan president a dictator, undemocratic. And then U.S. Secretary of State, more importantly, I believe it was this year in a visit to Guyana, called Venezuela a narco-terrorist regime. Well, the fact of the matter is, Venezuela has reached out and congratulated Kamala Pisar-Bissessor for her win. The same person who people were like, how could she say that? How could she say that? Well, she was looking at geopolitics at the time, and she was using a term used by one of our biggest trading allies, who also controls the fate of things like Dragon. She didn't come up with the term. She didn't bad talk Nicolas Maduro just out of thin air. She echoed sentiments, whether before or after they were said formally by Marco Rubio in his visit to Guyana. She echoed those sentiments. She was in line with the current American administration. And I do think that, yes, you have to be respectful for we're leaders, and there's civility and propriety and all of that, but there's also the fact that international politics, if you want to just be diplomatic and, dare I say, naive, your throat could just as easily get cut like in local politics, because every country has their own agenda, and Venezuela has shown what their agenda is. Their agenda is not, oh my gosh, we're so insulted, we will never speak to Kamala Pisar-Bissessor again. Their agenda is, and let me get the specific. We affirm our willingness to advance a common cooperation agenda that responds to the aspirations of our peoples and promotes peace, development, and the sovereignty of our nations. AKA, the reality is, if we want deals done like Dragon with Trinidad, we're going to not get upset over small things like that. Because when real world leaders get upset over small things like that, that's a specific decision made to send a message, not weakness being showed, oh my gosh, I'm having a temper tantrum. And whether we like it or not, it seems as though the United States is, I wouldn't say happy, but they're quite content. Because for better or worse, Kamala Persad-Bissessar, she gave a definitive stance. And it could have been the wrong stance. I'm not saying in the moment I judged it to be the right stance, but the point is it was a stance. And now she has Marco Rubio saying on X, she is a strong leader, friend, and U.S. ally who shares at POTUS's priorities on security and immigration. Arguably, if we want Dragon to eventually succeed, it might help if we're not viewed as being unfriendly to the American administration. Just say it. Now again, this does not necessarily mean that it was the right decision to make in the long run. It was the right stance to make in the moment. It was the right principled stance to take on the issue. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that when she was criticized for it on the campaign trail, I find it very ironic that it didn't necessarily work out, I think, the way Stuart Young thought it would. Where I will toot my own horn is I recognize that then, not just now seeing the current results. It could still take a turn down the line. Maybe the opposition leader shouldn't speak about important issues. But then again, a lot of people also agreed on the fact that when the opposition complained about Jindal's ongoing case, despite the fact that he went through the washing machine and joined the current Indian government, whose prime minister did congratulate. Let's not forget, despite her criticisms of one of his party members and MPs, I believe currently, because that's where Jindal is now. He wasn't there before, but he crossed the fence. He's one of Moody's people now, but the Indian Prime Minister did congratulate Kamala Persad-Bissessar on her victory. He didn't try to send any subliminal message of discontent, how you can mistreat my boy Jindal. So to some extent, it seems as though the part of the mistakes of the PNM was, for whatever reason, being very defensive. Because they were defensive of the energy sector and their agenda, they were very defensive of people outside the country, like Nicolas Maduro, who, let's just say, not everybody views him as a legitimate leader. And like Jindal, not everybody views him as a respected businessman that is not involved in corruption. Let's just say. And if you want us to take your democratic values and anti-corruption values seriously, associating yourself with that may not have been the smartest thing. But I might be one of the few people that actually cared about that part of the campaign. So let me leave it there. Last thing that I'll bring up today. Crime is one of the issues. To what extent it was a major issue, I'm not entirely sure. I think the economy and things like the SSR report, the Auditor General report, et cetera, or the fiasco over the Auditor General report from last year, those things I think rarely got into the minds of people. And the murder rate, the SOE maybe might have suppressed it enough that it wasn't on the forefront of people's minds, crime. But in Tunapuna it was. In Tunapuna, it seems as though a combination of how they viewed crime and the work Roger Alexander did on the ground got Roger Alexander over the win over Mr. Ford. Because the margin of victory was not that large, right? Ford got 6,943 votes to Roger's 8,466 votes. But Roger Alexander, by all accounts, had a great campaign, right? To some degree, impressed political analysts with how he conducted himself. Of course, we knew that he had experience in the public spotlight, and I would say how he was removed from beyond the tape was in no way detrimental to how he was perceived. It was detrimental to how the police service and leadership was perceived. But also, let's not forget, Tunapuna has something that a lot of the rest of the country does not have, and I think this is important to make note, to show how serious they are on crime. The Tunapuna Police Station Community Council, they are working with Tunapuna Police with regards to the Eagle Eye project, which I haven't necessarily heard if it has successfully been rolled out into other parts of the country. But it is an initiative for the private businessmen through this council, being the functional body, to help finance a camera system in Tunapuna, the Eagle Eye system, to help protect the communities and the businesses from crime. So Tunapuna, serious on crime. And I think there's a lot that the rest of the country could learn from this. And perhaps strategically, I didn't necessarily make this connection before the election, that this might be one of the constituencies where crime is a big deal, or it has one of the boroughs that looks at crime in a significant way. And putting Roger Alexander there, who right now might have the best profile of any politician with regards to crime. Now, once he is, what ministry he is potentially chosen to either lead or be a minister for, and what work he's able to do, of course, then he will be judged on those merits. Hopefully on the merits and not just on, by the way, things that are not as important. If he succeeds, of course, he will be praised. If he fails for whatever reason, and it's directly attributable to him, well, then he will have to take those lumps. But right now, he has the highest profile with regards to crime. And I think at the end of the day, it's interesting to see, at least in parts of the country, crime was a big factor. To go with the reports, the high crime and the desire for change and representation led to Esmond Ford's defeat, right? You don't even want to walk certain times of the night on regular streets, far less on back streets, because of how serious it is. And the thing about it is, crime is probably going to become more and more of an issue, because we just had the SOE. From the SOE, we went to elections. And there was crime during the campaigning period, but to some extent that might have caused crime to either be overlooked, or maybe even all of the heightened activity with the police being out in the public due to all of the campaigning, it might have maybe hampered a little bit some of the criminal activity. And of course, we also had Carnival that also suppressed crime to some degree. But now that all of that is over, now we have to see what's going to happen with crime. Are the figures going to go up? Is the murder rate going to go back up? And of course, the drugs have continued unabated in all likelihood. And it's going to probably become more in the forefront in the press, now that all of the politics is no longer in the news, right? There's only so long we could talk about the election results and the new ministers. And the UNC does have to hit the ground running here, because as far as I remember, Ayla's contract should be up in the middle of this month. No one expected her to be renewed. And of course, she's already been suspended and removed, and there's an acting commissioner. But even before her arrest, it was expected that her time was up. Even if Stuart Young was re-elected, and she was not arrested and she was not suspended. So now, potentially, Parliament will convene just in time to have to select the next Commissioner of Police. To some extent, Junior Benjamin could remain as acting, I would imagine, probably until the process is complete. But there's potentially a new agenda. And there's a lot of questions coming out of this election with regards to issues that you may or may not have considered. I'm talking about certain members of the executive that might have done certain things that might be questionable, actions that may or may not be tied to a certain AG from a certain other island telling his government, don't contest that. And the police officers involved who were rewarded by being promoted, what's going to happen to them? I wouldn't necessarily say what I want to see happens to them, because that's an uninformed opinion. But what I would hope would happen is, at least to some extent, a change in government means we could ventilate certain things that could have an impact on the leadership of the TTPS, and potentially, by fixing them, could help fix the leadership of the TTPS. The Police Service Commission did say they want to bring the police service back into good repute, to repair some of the damage done to its reputation. Well, you have a new government. We have to wait and see how things are going to go. The one good thing is, I do believe Roger Alexander was frustrated with the direction as an organization that the TTPS was going in, and that's, in my opinion, one of the reasons why he offered himself up. So hopefully what this means is, with his experience, he's going to fix certain things from the leadership perspective of the police service. That's not going to fix the whole crime problem. It's not. But obviously, if we're going to start somewhere, or if we're going to do anything, at least doing that should help the situation. It shouldn't hurt. But there's more to it than that beyond the police service. Let's not forget that. Anyway, I know we have a caller. We'll take the call, then we have to take a break if possible sometime. But we'll take the call first. We don't want to keep him waiting too long. Tobago Martin is on the line. Good morning, caller. You're on air.
Good morning, Sean, and good morning to all your listeners. I'm seeing we talking security and what we're doing, and okay, we have lots of recent information for us to start making hard decisions. There is a joint select committee report on the day of policing, and I am hoping that all the new ministers for security will again revisit that report. In that report, it identifies some errant officers who are in the executive, because there is a merit list out there with a couple of those names to be selected or disregarded as a police as the COP. So I am hoping that none of those names who is in that report surface to the top. And I don't want to go through, I leave it for people to think, but there is a couple of them, and I could call them out, but I don't want to do that. So there is information available, and I myself will continue to raise it, so we make decision based on information and evidence we have. Because since 2015, the action out of that, the recommendation out of that, all the police commissioners did nothing. The government did nothing. So we were basically kept right where we are. So we have a time now to review that and see who the cream of the crop in the police service goes to the top. The other thing that I'm happy about, I'm seeing the utterances out of Guyana. Barrett, the vice president, said Trinidad has not approached him since Trump said the dragon gas deal is no more. Is in all the newspaper, Starbrick News, I think it was on the Guardian or Express, that nobody in Trinidad approached him, and he's willing to explore opportunities to gas to Trinidad, to process gas into Trinidad. So they are willing, they're sending all the signals. So I'm hoping that the energy minister and the foreign affairs minister understand that, because I think the ambassador who we sent, Conrad, was really useless. And he has to come back. So there is an opportunity to deepen the relationship. And the signal is, because I think Guyana government was very apprehensive of doing any business with Trinidad, the former Trinidad government, because the way they basically inserted themselves into the election process in Guyana. And more importantly, people have to understand that they wouldn't have touched us with a 10-fold pole, and people have to remember there was an interview that KCR did with Akash Samaru, and one of the questions is, what are the other options? And at the ending of KCR's statement, he said Ghana is down the road. Yes, he's willing to deal with Ghana. Ghana is down the road. And it's still bitter in Ghanai's mouth, the politicians and things like that.
Sorry, who said that?
Keith Christopher Rowley.
Right.
Said, KCR, I don't like to call people names, said that they say there are several options, but Guyana, go back to that interview, is down the road. So he was not willing to engage Guyana, because they know what they basically did. They soured the relationship. And we as a country might have been put into the back door of Venezuela or Haiti. But I think we have a chance to exhale, and hopefully we have the right people to make those decisions. Okay, I go and have a nice morning.
Thank you, Kola. A couple of things. One, the PNM did say when Stuart Young was talking about revamping or changing how the commissioner was selected, they can't necessarily go and get lower ranked officers to be considered for commissioner of police, or at least it's not easy. It's without changing legislation. Now, I don't necessarily know exactly what he means, but the implication of what he said and what the Police Service Commission said, that essentially the pool for candidates are the DCPs and the ACPs. Right? I don't know to what extent you can consider senior superintendents, because I do think senior superintendents have put themselves up for commissioner of police. So I'm not entirely sure. But based on what the Police Service Commission said and what Stuart Young said, to some extent there's a limit of how far the Police Service Commission could go, and we may or may not be limited to a certain pool of candidates for commissioner of police. At least ever since Gary was selected, because he was outside the service, and not a lot of people within the service want to see someone selected outside the service. One of the issues we have is the fact that you select someone that the rank and file don't like, and like we saw with Dwayne Gibbs, they're not going to take it well. But to what degree that's insubordination, and I would find a cultural feeling of the service, that lack of discipline, and the embarrassment that it implies, let's be real, it is what it is. There is one person I think that would be within the current pool that they would consider, Wayne Meister, ACP down in South. I think he might be the best candidate for the job. I think unfortunately the DCPs that exist, there are two. It's hard to separate them from the current executive that they have been a part of, and whether fair or not, and some of them, they have baggage that I think disqualifies them outright, and questions that the public should have that needs to be answered. But I won't get into the details about that. Selecting them might be a mistake for the current administration, in my opinion. And even for Junior Benjamin, I don't know if he could successfully extricate himself from being perceived to be part of a failed executive. And perhaps the police service needs a full culture shift, and I would argue potentially it needs to be, that is one public service that needs full turnover at the top, because at the end of the day, what's going on? We're not talking about an office worker here. We're talking about people whose responsibility is to reduce the murder rate. And a failure there means people die. The stakes are at a different level than a lot of other situations in if it's fair or not for their career and their job. I mean, to some extent, senior board members and CEOs, the wrong people will waste a lot of taxpayers' dollars. But I think life is an even greater stake than that. Now, with regards to the Guyana-TNT relations, basically, I think you were correct in what you said. The one major failure of our foreign policy was our relations with Guyana. And it was one of the things where, you know, to what extent, I did touch on it at times for the last couple of years, but I think you were right. The perception that I had was Guyana didn't want to have anything to do with us. And I, to some extent, call out the fact that look at how we acted like we were the bee's knees, to use a politically correct phrase. Hopefully I'm not misusing it. But we were the game in town. We were big brother, everybody else was little brother. And all of a sudden, Guyana gets a windfall, and they're like, haha, time out, buddies. You all ain't no big brother to me anymore. You know, at best, we're the same age. But it could go beyond that. TNT, you might have to end up trying to figure out how to be little brother. And to be honest, it's not just Guyana. One could argue. There are other members of CARICOM where, with regards to the prominence of our nation, if we are not careful and we want to keep doing the nonsense that we like to do sometimes, we might be relegated to the back of the bus compared to other nations whose leadership is showing a bit more, like Barbados and Jamaica, and of course, to some extent, with regards to their leadership, with how their president has communicated to CARICOM, as well as the fact that they have the resources now to help the region. Guyana might be the big brother. And to some extent, and a lot of people might not like this, but look, the election results resets everything. Because even if the PNM wins in the next 5 years or 10 years from now, the point is a new PNM administration might successfully separate itself from the baggage of the previous PNM administration. But more importantly, the current UNC administration don't have none of that baggage. And it hard resets that relationship. And this might be one of the things where at the end of the day, it made sense that the UNC took very, very decisive stance, whether we like it or not, from the position of the opposition. They took decisive stances so that if they got into government, they don't have to deal with the foreign policy baggage of the UNC, of the PNM, right? To some extent now, they don't have to worry about Dragon. And some people might say, well, that's not fair. We didn't get that opportunity. Well, those are the breaks. The PNM did a masterful job with regards to engaging with the Americans and Chinese, and in a separate way, the Venezuelans. Of course, they couldn't necessarily get the Americans and the Venezuelans to kind of be on the same page. But Guyana, being such an important regional partner and arguably low-hanging fruit, this might be one of the ways to kind of kickstart, get a deal done with Guyana, see how it could be done. It might be in the form of a pipeline up to Atlantic LNG. Who knows? Obviously, if you need to ship it by boat, you need an LNG plant, and then at that point, what's the point of having any relationship with Trinidad? Right? I'm not entirely sure of all the logistics, but the potential is there. If Guyana is willing, then we should be willing too. Again, we are at a point where we don't have the luxury of letting politics override national important decisions. So it can't be the case where, oh, well, I PNM till I'm dead, so I don't want to see the UNC succeed or nothing. To hell with that. The nation needs wins. And the reason why the PNM was voted out, in part, was because their philosophies and plans weren't necessarily getting us all of the wins we need. Now we're just hoping that the UNC is going to make better decisions. They have to prove it. I did say I was going to take a break, but that's not going to happen anymore. We have another call on the line. Good morning, caller, you're on the air.
Good morning.
Morning.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a point on the issue of squatting as it relates to deforestation. Now, this has been happening for decades in this country, and no government has ever addressed this. This will eventually impact this country very negatively. I'm sorry for how the call is sounding, but I'm having a lot of feedback.
We can hear you fine.
Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
We can hear you fine. So you just talk not normally. It's fine.
All right, okay. All right, so this will eventually affect this country very negatively, and especially in terms of global warming. Now, I am highlighting this issue because of the recent highway that was opened. That is the Elmina-Clark Highway. Now, I drove through this place, and I saw beautiful virgin forest. And this is a plea to whatever government goes into power now. Well, not whatever government. We know which one is going in power. This is a plea to do something about squatting in this country, and especially in this place where it is virgin forest still. Now, I grew up in the East, and I drive every day along the Valencia stretch, with huge signs saying protected forests, except none of the forest has been protected. And if I go a little further to areas like Matura, the same thing has happened. So this is an urgent plea for this country not to become like Easter Island, which because of deforestation ended up in a very tragic way. So thank you for the job that you do, and I appreciate the opportunity that I could have made this point. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, caller. It's an important point. Do we have another call? It's an important point. I'll get to it because I think you actually pointed out one of the downfalls of issues like that, or at least you implied it. But we'll take the next call first. Good morning, caller. You on the air?
Morning, Sean.
Morning.
I want to refer you to Calypsos by Black Stalin. 1981 vampire year, and we could make it if we try. Stalin talk about the politicians sucking the blood of labor. And wherever you see the unions go, that's where the elections come for. But my analysis of the fallout is this. Overall, PNM lost 100,000 votes compared to 2021. UNC gained 20,000. The Patriotic Front gained 21,000. And I can tell you what caused that. Former Prime Minister Rowley has made a mockery of our democracy. A mockery. What PNM got was the loyalty vote. And you see the salaries commission, when you accept those recommendations,
yes,
that was the last straw.
Yeah. Yeah.
This thing started for me with the guy different mergers. And then Hines stand up in a speech and the Kwesi and Sawan said that he was responsible for that. And subsequent to that, the murder rate keeps going up and up and up. Second cause, a lack of emotional intelligence by the powers that be. We spend 50 million on commissioner inquiry and wait until possibly the last few days before the election to give $1 million to the victims and the family of the victims. That's it, right? Then you gotta look at the priorities. The only priority was swimming pool, library, community center. People ain't in water. So you go build a swimming pool and you bring in water. That can't work. And on top of that now, you have economics. Because resources dwindling. We ain't getting no major funds. The ones that we have in the future, because America tell you go ahead before you go ahead. That is what caused Prime Minister Rowley to lose the election. It's not that PNM lost it.
Yeah.
It's Rowley lost. Because 100,000 voters withheld the vote. Now going forward, for me, the PNM days to remain strong. People will vote. But once they realize that we have their interests at heart, we, going forward, must have a clear, comprehensive plan of how to develop Trinidad and Tobago.
Caller, I'll have to ask you to end it there. I'll actually speak to that very last point you said, but we have a caller that's been waiting since we took your call. So we have to give that caller a chance. We don't want to lose them. Thank you for calling in, caller. We have San Juan waiting on the line. Good morning, caller. You on the air?
Morning. Boy, that fella feeling parliament out.
Oh gosh. I mean,
All right.
let's
All
not.
right. Listen,
Yeah, go ahead, caller.
I congratulate the people and them for the winning in the election. I want to see all the corruption cases follow up. I want to see this reforestation this lady talking about, that highway had to be built. The problem is the northern range.
Yeah, I was thinking that
That's
too.
where the problem is. The northern range where our water is still bubbling coming from. Right? And it's there they were supposed to go and get water instead of the salination plants and all of that. Right? So, as I say, we'll look on and see how the thing running. You all have a good day.
Thank you, caller. And we also have a comment from our social media page. If you could put that up on the screen. Nepotism and putting square pegs in round holes generally cause governments to fall. Example, the PNM. I mean, at the end of the day, it might be hindsight, but there's truth in it, right? I don't think anyone is reasonably going to say that's totally untrue, right? It might be more complicated than that, but generally speaking, to some extent, that's what happened. Especially the square pegs and round holes part. UNC, put policymakers in place who can carry out your agenda. At the end, at the public service level, take your time and go for competence, efficiency, productivity, and customer service. Be fair and transparent. And this comment, I have to agree, especially that last part, 100%. What I want to see is UNC not make the same mistakes as the PNM. The problem is, these things tend to be the typical political decisions being made because you have other considerations, not just doing people's work, but also who you had a reward, who support you financially, whose agenda you have to, you have to placate them a little bit if you want to keep being financed and blah, 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 blah. And hopefully, I guess the difference between a great leader and an average leader is someone, not that they're not going to have these things to consider. They're not going to have to consider the internal politics of their party and their supporters and their base and etc. They're not going to have their finances to consider, but rather the ones that can manage that while still trying to select people for competence, efficiency, productivity, customer service, and transparency. Fairness, meritocracy. Can they manage that? To some extent, to be honest, I don't know within the last 20 years if we've really seen anybody do that, right? I hesitate to say even that Patrick Manning in his last term was able to do that because on some of his appointments maybe, but at the end of the day, that term in office ended in spectacular fashion, and arguably there were mistakes that he made objectively speaking. So it was not a perfect term at all. Now the UNC has a fresh slate. One of the things is that this is not the partnership. So ironically, when the UNC said stop living in the past, to some extent, they had to also heed that warning they themselves were saying. But it's not the same people. It's not. And hopefully, this election result, in a way, did what I wanted. It sent a message. I didn't expect this to happen quite like this, but it definitely sent a message because it's not as though the voter turnout was low because people just didn't vote and we just got the bases. The PNM lost a lot of ground and the UNC gained ground. The UNC gained voters. So it was both voting out and voting in. One could argue, as opposed to one or the other. And to me, this is a sign, this is a warning. PNM, you need to change because what you all were on, we not on that. And the UNC should also heed the warning. Don't make the same mistakes. You might get re-elected the next time, but 2 elections down the line, don't make the same mistakes. Some of the mistakes were so egregious, one would hope that it will be obvious. Don't tell people we don't have money to give you salary increases and then take a salary increase. Don't be hypocritical like Stuart Young on the campaign trail talking about how he fought for the workers then as a lawyer for unions, but he couldn't say that he fought for the workers, for the public service workers now, as a minister in cabinet. I am pointing out his error in communication. The UNC, they are now in the hot seat. They are now sitting in the big chair. Kamala Persad-Bissessar is now sitting in the seat Rowley sat on. So she has to, hopefully she has all the thick skin, because she will be criticized, because it will be her agenda, her policies. There's no P&M policies anymore. We're done with that. They're out. The country has decided. They're on the hot seat now. Now, one of the things that the caller before was saying was a comprehensive plan to move forward. This is where I am still not happy of the political environment. The manifestos did not do it for me. Certain member candidates going up for the UNC did not do it for me. Some of them I'm applauding. But even Roger Alexander doesn't have a detailed plan for the police service. Now, granted, he needs to actually get there to have a detailed plan, to be fair to him. But with regards to the economy, you don't need to go all the way with regards to details, but you need to have some reasonable idea and have some initiatives that potentially could be a starting point. I didn't necessarily get that from the UNC, right? 10% as a starting point for wage negotiations for the public sector, that's not an economic agenda to help the economy. It might be necessary to help the workers, depending on cost of living, if we have any increases because of the trade situation and whatever Trump is doing. Anyone that wants to criticize Trump for what he's doing with regards to those tariffs, it's too aggressive, right? And it's tone deaf. And it potentially betrays the fact that his understanding of how economies work, from his perspective of the businessman, now we're seeing the limitations. It didn't come into play so much last time with the tariffs with China back in 2016. That term, that 4-year term, it might be coming into play now. We might have to deal with the fallout. So there could be a requirement for wage increases. But the economic agenda for the good of the country, for instance, tourism, agriculture, diversification, manufacturing, how is that all going to look moving forward? To what extent will they prioritize it? Because diversification is like deforestation. It's one of those things that everybody will agree we need diversification and deforestation is bad. But with regards to diversification, what have we seen? With regards to town and country planning and regulating where people build homes, let's not forget, within the last couple of years, we saw people build on a gas line where they were not supposed to build. It was a gas line in the ground. It was zoned. Nobody builds here. They built some garage structure on it. They got water and electricity hooked up to it. No questions asked. The left hand had no idea what the right hand doing, because the right hand didn't even know what was going on. The NGC had to come after the fact and say that had to go. And then everybody want to say, well, that's unfair. Unfair, my foot. But things like that, not regulating things that should be regulated, and then people just squat and build wherever, and then you want to say, oh God, how you can kick out the poor people from their home? They're not supposed to be there. And that's what the last caller said about it being on the northern range. Now, I don't know to what extent you could actually collect water all on the northern range and easily pipe it down to south. Our water distribution system is not like that. Water used in the northern half of the country, it's collected in the northern half, in the southern half, etc., etc. To the east, well, I'm not entirely sure that currently plans if it's the whole east-west corridor. But regardless, that point that you made, when squatters cut down trees on the mountains, and then it affects water retention and water flows, and all of a sudden now you have landslides and et cetera, et cetera. That's a problem, right? That's a problem. Of course, building on flood-prone areas doesn't help either. And then everybody wants the government to help them fix the problem. But if you're a squatter, why should society help you protect your investment when you invested in something you should not have? I'm not saying that they don't deserve houses. I'm just saying something should be done to ensure that they don't build where they're not supposed to build. Now, with regards to cutting highways and cutting down the forests in parts of South and East Trinidad and other rural areas, I would argue that potentially we might need more of that, but in a controlled way. In a controlled way. We do, I think, and yes, to some extent, on the east and southern parts of the island, we could see more urbanization, more concrete, to help with more development. but in a controlled way, in a managed way, so that it doesn't get egregious and cause unnecessary harm and negative detriment to the environment. Because those parts of the country deserve to be connected efficiently to the rest of the country. So I'll always have that. And if we're going to have to cut highways into forests, so be it. But a highway into a forest and uncontrolled squatting is two different things. And also don't forget illegal quarrying. And that's one of the things. Corruption is like deforestation, is like diversification. How much of it actually gets cleaned up? The PNM said, look at all the things the UNC did. That's nice. How many UNC MPs that allegedly did anything during partnership? I mean, a lot of us outside of politics suspect that a lot went on during the partnership. But if you're the government and you are campaigning on the issue of corruption that the other party did wrongdoing, okay, how much successful cases did you take to the prosecutor, to the court? How many convictions did you get? Because if you got none or very few, then how could you say you're strong on corruption? Now we have to wait and see what the UNC will do, because this is one of the things where governments don't really do anything about corruption. And there I start with my first criticism of the UNC for their new term in office. Not a direct criticism, but an observation, politically speaking. So it's not directly attributed to the UNC's current administration, at least not yet. How many politicians like to close windows and loopholes as opposed to leave them open so they themselves could exploit it? That's why they don't tell. They don't show and tell, because they don't want to reveal themselves what they're doing. That's the implication. Prove us wrong and do better. So a comprehensive plan to move forward, we have to wait and see. Corruption investigations, we have to wait and see. Working on things like deforestation and other issues like that, which are not priorities in their election campaign agenda, we have to wait and see. Meritocracy in the public service, we have to wait and see. Transparency in government action, implementation, and communication, we have to wait and see. The last time Congressman Bissessa was elected, I was more than ready to give her a chance to see what will come out of it. Same thing with Dr. Rowley. And dare I say I was disappointed both times. I'm not necessarily going to hold everything against her now, because at the end of the day, she is the Prime Minister now. And regardless of what we think of her in the long run, we should do whatever we can to encourage her to do better. If it doesn't happen, then we could criticize. But until then, let's still be positive. All right. Thanks to the callers. Thanks to the comments on social media. This is Talking One on WESN show. Michael Small here. Oh, wait. Sorry. One last comment. Blessings, TNT. I suggest we should have patience and allow the new government to put things in place and wait 2 to 3 years for any back pay to be paid to the workers. Patience, please. I beg for us to have some patience, please. Thank you. And that basically is in line to what I just said. Let's wait and see what they do and not hold anything of the past against them, because that ain't going to help nothing right now. It is what it is. They have been chosen. But I think what the commenter said, let's not be rushing for things like back pay right now. We need to stabilize the economy in a whole before we could worry about who get what slice of what pie. The pie too small to slice up like that right now. Let's look about growing the pie, investing to have a bigger pie. Then we could worry about who could get what slice. Have a good day, folks. Stay safe. Remember your allegiance to the Republic and to each other. And as always, never forget that it's nice to be nice and sweet TNT. Let's try to make it back to where we used to be. And we'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
WESN.
My name is Dr. Stephen Carroll, the CEO at Community Hospital of Seventh-day Adventist, and we are committed to making good private health care affordable.
For all your medical needs, including dental, radiology, laparoscopy, behavioral and mental health, along with many other services, contact us for more information at 235-5479.
Community Hospital of Seventh-day Adventist,
where good private health care is affordable.
Come celebrate 15 years of Caribbean literature. It's a homecoming with stories,